Support for the Capital Connection comes from New York State United Teachers, working to support students, educators, and public schools as the center of their communities through the Public Schools Unite Us initiative. It's the Capital Connection. Welcome, everyone. I'm David Gustina. Joining us this week is New York State Comptroller Tom DiNapoli, the Chief Fiscal Officer for the entire state of New York. Welcome back, Comptroller DiNapoli.
David, always warms my heart, especially this time of year, to be speaking with you. So thank you for inviting me back.
Yes, we are sitting here in what is a frigid day outside. Temperatures hovering in the single digits to teens in most spots. But you know, you mentioned it, the cold weather. Part of what impacts the state financially is weather. And certainly when you have cold snaps and then hot streaks, that kind of weather damages roads and infrastructure and all sorts of things. So, you know, you do have to think about the weather in some sense, don't you, when it comes to fiscal responsibility?
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, the good news is, you know, we've been through this enough that I think the state has been pretty well prepared. In fact, when there was some of that very bad weather that came down over the weekend, I was on the roads for a bit, and the plows were out there on the thruway, and, you know, give our crews credit for keeping on top of things. And, you know, generally speaking, this has not been an unexpectedly difficult winter in terms of snow and ice. In fact, January, there wasn't a whole lot. In many parts of the state, February has been a different story. It's been a real February for sure. But I think we'll be on track to manage that. There are so many other issues that impact on the budget, you know, even more so right now. Biggest concern from my perspective is the uncertainty coming out of Washington with the new administration. What will that mean for the relationship between states and the federal government, particularly between New York and Washington? Any given year, our state budget is 35 to 40% passed through federal funds. So if they change those formulas, if they do target Medicaid, which seems to be one of the big program areas they've been talking about targeting, that means less money for New York State. That's going to make our future budgets a lot more problematic.
Well, this is unprecedented, isn't it, Tom? I mean, when is the last time you've seen this kind of attack? Now, I know SALT, the state and local tax deduction, was one thing we lost at some point, but this seems to be being done without the research in advance.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. SALT seems to be one of those areas where perhaps there may be a compromise that might actually be to our benefit. I don't think they're talking about repealing it. I mean, some are, but maybe there'll be an increase in the threshold. How much and how many New Yorkers will benefit if they do change that, you know, remains to be seen. You know, you go back decades ago, Nixon administration talked about changing certain formulas into block grants, which would have the effect of there being less money. So in some ways, some of this is not brand new, but I think you're right in the sense of just the level of rhetoric that really talks about gutting government programs. And you're seeing now the beginnings of that in Washington with all the folks that are just summarily being dismissed and laid off. And you're right in terms of not thinking it through. What do we have in recent days? Some of those with expertise on managing nuclear systems, you know, were let go. And so they realized some of that could impact on national security. They had to rehire them. So there seems to not be a lot of thought going on right now. But, you know, I really worry. One of the biggest expenses in the state budget, which we've talked about before, and certainly you see it in the governor's budget proposal this year, is the Medicaid program. And those dollars, unfortunately, the costs keep going up. We get a significant amount of money from the federal government to help us with those costs.
Tom, how much? How much? I mean, this could blow a hole in things, right? I mean, this is the biggest portion of the budget, this health care portion, Medicaid.
Yeah, it's Medicaid and school aid are always the two biggest portions. And so you're really talking about the potential for billions of dollars less. And that's really going to be a challenge because already those costs have been going up. Those two areas are the big cost drivers. So I'm very concerned about where this is all headed. And, you know, what we said in our budget report is that there's no contingency in this budget plan the governor put forward to deal with any of this. And I know one of the challenges is the obvious one. We don't know what the cost impact will be. Right? So it is hard in that sense to come up with a contingency since you don't know what the cuts may be. But we mean the Controller's Office. We've given credit to the governor and the legislature in recent years for building up our reserve funds, which has been very, very good, over $21 billion now. But those reserve funds should really be there for a real financial or fiscal emergency, like the close down that happened when COVID hit, like when the financial markets, you know, tanked and we had the Great Recession, was it 12, 13 years ago, whatever. To deal with the restructuring of the state-federal relationship, that should not be what those reserve funds are going to be used for. So I'm a little concerned that, already we see in this budget proposal, the out-year budget gaps now talking about growing to $27 billion, over 3 years. So this budget, while it's very generous in the short run, already we have problems in aligning our spending and our revenue. Add on top of that possible federal cutbacks, we really could be in a very, very tight squeeze in the near future. So I'm certainly very concerned about that.
Yeah, and all of this spending from the governor and her budget proposal is to attempt to deal with affordability, which we're quickly seeing is potentially damaging in and of itself if you spend too much, with the potential for this other money to be pulled away. And on top of all that, you have the congestion pricing plan, which they're worried about, right? So if somehow they reached in and stopped that, then you've got the MTA budget, which is already struggling to fill a hole.
Yeah. Yeah. Look, I don't think anybody would disagree. The governor is absolutely on point with what New Yorkers are concerned about in terms of affordability. And you look at many of the specific proposals. I mean, look, more money for schools, more money for child care, which is another big issue. We did a report on that recently to show many parts of our state are what we call child care deserts, more money for housing. I mean, you go down the list, mental health programs. It's hard to argue with some of those policy priorities, but the challenge is, yes, we have the money now. As we've talked about on your show many times in recent months, our tax revenue continues to come in higher than projected. That's still the case. So, I'm confident we have the money today to pay for the kind of programs that have been outlined by the governor in her proposal. The concern I have is a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now. The worst thing, David, would be to make commitments for programs, especially new funding options, and not have the money there to back it up. And then you run into the situation where you then have to pull back on some of those commitments in the not-too-distant future. So I do hope, understanding that the affordability question is a serious one, the governor's proposing a tax cut for middle-class families that most New Yorkers would benefit from. Again, hard to argue with the merit of that, but I do hope the legislature and the governor, as they hammer this out for the final budget, hopefully by April 1st, they make some choices as far as spending that will have not just implications of adding money over the next, 2-3 years, but perhaps think a little more thoughtfully about restructuring some of the programs. Look, the most obvious one is Medicaid. It's a big expense area. The state-funded portion of it is going to be about $36 billion. There has always been conversations about how to restructure the program in a way that doesn't deny services but make it more efficient. We always put out audits that talk about ways to save money in Medicaid that never seem to get implemented. We had another one recently identified I think it was about $16 billion in opportunities to save money. I would hope there'd be a more thoughtful examination of our audits, what we've recommended, the tendency, because it's easier is just to add money to programs and not really talk about how to make them sustainable on the long term.
No wonder, Tom. No wonder people get so cynical. Here you have, and you've told us this many times, you have gone in, researched where they can find money, where there are problems they can fix. And now if we look at Musk and Doge, here they come in, everyone is yelling, you didn't wait, you didn't look, you didn't see what we need to cut. Well, even when you do that, Tom, the lawmakers don't respond to your recommendations. Yeah. Isn't this just one more sign of when we do things wrong, when we don't take the advantage of improving government by your suggestions, you get a lot of cynical people out there, and maybe some of them are saying, good, go ahead, cut. We can't rely on the lawmakers to listen to the recommendations.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of our frustrations. People often say, well, you make all these recommendations. How come nothing happens? Well, we don't have an enforcement authority. And I'm not saying necessarily that we should, but we always hope that what we put out, well, we at least would hope there'd be more conversation about what we propose. And I think as people have gotten frustrated, and it's fair to say that frustration contributed to the result of the national elections last year, then you get this group that comes in, and maybe it sounds good in terms of what, government efficiency, but if it's based on a total disregard, for government and a real effort not to be more efficient, but in fact to just destroy, at some point people are going to wake up and realize maybe that's not quite what they had in mind. But
because among all those people in those agencies of government that you're firing and letting go, many of those will end up being people who would vote for you.
Yeah, I think we're in a very complex time right now, and that's all the more reason why at the state level I'd like to think that we could be smarter and really demonstrate to New Yorkers that we are capable of managing our finances responsibly, providing quality services, especially for people in need, but doing it in a way that's efficient and sustainable on the long term. You just can't continue to, raise spending on every single program and raise taxes as a way to deal with these issues. We have to be a bit more thoughtful.
We're speaking with the very thoughtful Tom DiNapoli, the State Comptroller of New York. I'm David Gustina, and you're listening to the Capital Connection. Well, I saw something move in the news fairly recently, Tom, and I immediately went, I got to ask Tom about this. It scared the zippers off me. Now, that is that I read, now you have to correct me and correct all the listeners now who I'm sure have been thinking about this, that hedge funders were betting that the president of the United States, Donald Trump, was going to crash the stock market at some point. Those of us that have 401ks or 403bs, we're told keep that money in the stock market for the long term. But with all the chaos in the first days and, the markets being based a lot on anxiety, with a statement like that, it can create just that kind of anxiety.
Well, it's one reason why we're not doing more in hedge funds. Years ago, prior to my time, the pension fund had some hedge fund investments. But, the more I looked at it, I said, first of all, there's very little transparency in how the hedge funds operate, and they frankly weren't delivering the returns that had been, promised. So we haven't done a hedge fund investment in probably well over a decade. But I would say this: I don't think any president, including this one, wants to crash the markets. But the volatility has been there. In fact, David, you may have seen we put out our pension fund results for the third quarter. Yeah. Because we were on the state fiscal year, so we still have till March 31st. But for December 3rd, basically we were flat, and we had like a tiny, tiny dip because the markets were very up and down, particularly in December. So I think the markets are still trying to figure out where this is all headed. From my perspective, as trustee for the pension fund, $270 billion, give or take. What's important to me is that March 31st valuation date, because that's when we value the fund, and that's the number that goes into our calculation for how much we're going to charge our government employers, right? So the state government, all the local governments across New York State and school districts, that has an impact on taxpayers, on local budgets. So, we had last year at the end of the fiscal year an 11.5% return, which was really good when you consider our long-term goal is a 5.9% return. So I'm hoping we have a good quarter, this go around, because I want to beat that 5.9% number. I don't want to, if I can avoid it, raise the contribution rate, because that does have an impact on, especially on local governments. But the good news is people are living a lot longer, well into their 90s, so our payouts are getting longer. The legislature and the governor, to help with retention and recruitment of state and local workers, enhance the pension benefit, Tier 6 reform. Some folks would like to see even more in that regard. Retirees would like to see a more generous COLA. So even when we get a good number on investment return, there are other kinds of pressures on our pension fund out of our direct control that may have an impact. So all of this depends, though, on the market staying strong. And although we're very diversified and we're certainly not totally dependent on the stock market, that is the biggest part of our portfolio. So I wouldn't worry about what the hedge funders say in terms of Trump crashing the market. I don't think that's the case. But we certainly are in a very volatile investment period. So I think, and I don't give investment advice, even though I'm the trustee for the pension fund. But, what I always say to folks in terms of how we even operate, if you think that you're going to time it, right, every time something else happens, you're going to change your strategy. By the time you change your strategy, things change again. So if you have confidence in how you have your assets invested, usually the best advice is just stay the course.
All right, we'll stay the course. I believe that was George H.W. Bush. Stay the course. 1,000 points of light. All right. Well, you mentioned childcare before, and you did do this report on the childcare challenges in New York State. They're quite enormous. And I just talked to the co-head of Healthy Minds, Healthy Kids, this coalition that's come to Albany in the last couple of weeks to lobby on behalf of children and mental health. But as you point out, stark numbers, including the fact that New York's average child care cost of $14,621 is the second highest in the U.S.
Yep, it's second only to Massachusetts. And certainly the high prices are a challenge and an impediment. Workforce issues we also identified. It's very hard for daycare service providers to attract and retain employees because the salaries tend to be very low. They tend not to have generous benefits as other employment positions have. You also saw that during COVID, you saw a number of these jobs disappear. A number of programs and providers went out of business. And although there's certainly been somewhat of a recovery of some of those jobs and providers, it's not been the case across the state. In fact, we identified a number of census tracts that we would describe as child care deserts, and that's really a concern. If it's bad enough that the prices are high and some of the programs have a challenge retaining staff, but we saw, looking at New York State's Office of Children and Family Services, 60% of the state census tracts were child care deserts in 2023 data. I mean, that's a real concern. So, the governor, again, this is another area where the governor is putting more money in for child care services, including more capital money to help providers, have the facilities available, more support for home-based programs as well. But it's a big issue and one that it needs to get very clear focus. So is it a priority? Certainly, with what the governor has laid out in her budget, yes, but we should not underestimate the challenges that are there. And if we're talking about economic development, we need to view providing quality child care services as an important way to ensure that everyone that wants to be in the workforce can be, especially, obviously, working moms, working women. If they don't have a place where they feel their child could be cared for in a safe and secure way, that may stop them from being gainfully employed. And we don't want to see that happen. We need all the talent available to fill the positions that are available. So I think the child care issue is certainly a family issue. It's also an economic development issue. It's an important issue to businesses as well.
We're speaking with New York State Comptroller Tom DiNapoli on this week's Capital Connection. I'm David Gustina. Tom, let me ask you about this. Your fellow Democrats were looking to pass a bill that would delay filling the special election seat for Elise Stefanik, who's going off to be UN ambassador. And one of the reasons your Democratic colleagues gave for stalling that was to save money. And, many, I have to say, including me, think it was a rather transparent attempt to keep a Republican out of that district for a while. And I'm wondering, just in the financial question, you don't have to get too political if you don't want to, although I'm happy if you do. How much do you really save by doing that?
David, I've never known you to be cynical. I'm shocked that you would put it that way.
You knew who my mentor was. He was a very positive man.
Look, I think it's fair to say that there's probably more politics behind that initial idea than there was anything else, but you very quickly saw a retreat when you saw some of the
Indeed.
pushback on it. So, let's just chalk that up to a failed attempt, and from what I understand, maybe things change from day to day, but it even seems that her ascending to that UN position has been somewhat delayed, also probably for political reasons, because they're very concerned about the slim majority that Republicans have in the House, and Trump took a few people out, gave them the position, so that slim majority is very tenuous, and with all the big issues that are coming down, there are so many factions on the Republican side, right? People always talk about the Democrats being split and fractured. It really seems in recent years that the Democrats, when it comes down to voting in the House of Representatives, they all kind of stick together, whether they're from the left or the center or whatever. The Republicans are the ones. Even you saw earlier this year with Speaker Johnson's position up again. Yeah, that didn't happen without there was some rocks in that road before he finally got reelected as House Speaker. So I think some of that is politics on both sides in terms of how they're viewing it. Look, in terms of where we're headed, politically, should there be any shifting of the pendulum back after the results of 2024? I think it would be fair to say the pundits all point to the House of Representatives as the most likely place for the Democrats to have a chance to take one of the three branches back, meaning President and Senate and House. I'm leaving the Supreme Court out for now, so probably branches is the wrong word, but those three power centers, the most likely place is for the House of Representatives. So all of these decisions very much play into political calculations, and as you saw, even for Stefanik's seat, the Democrats already have coalesced behind a candidate, and the Republicans are still trying to figure out, who they're going to back. So is that a likely pickup for Democrats, there in the North Country? Doubtful, but, hey, wasn't that long ago Congressman Bill Owens was there. He was a Democrat, so, that'll be an interesting race to watch.
Well, we'll see, but I bet the constituents there are watching what's happening, and I don't think citizens of New York or citizens of this country appreciate when games are being played, political games.
No.
They don't like it.
And no one wants to be unrepresented,
That's
whether
right.
whether you like the person or not, or whether the one you vote for wins, you don't want to have an empty seat. You need a voice in Washington for constituent service, for delivering for the district. So that trial balloon, got shot down pretty quickly. So let's chalk that up to
lesson learned.
A moment, lesson learned. Yeah. Well, lessons tend not to be learned in
That's
politics,
right.
but let's just say it was a trial balloon that failed.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of empty seats, right now we don't know what's going to happen, but there are meetings going on as you and I speak on a Tuesday about the fate of the New York City mayor, Eric Adams. But potentially we could be in a situation where Governor Kathy Hochul removes him from that seat. We've been watching what's been happening with the Trump administration, getting him to agree to be tough on immigration in what seems like almost a quid pro quo. You do this and we'll stop the prosecution, which then had these more conservative prosecutors quitting because they felt that this was unjust. So your thoughts on this whole thing right now, either way?
It's hard to keep up with it because everything changes so rapidly. For four of his top deputy mayors, who, as far as I understood it, were all very well regarded, resigning. Those are the folks who are running the city day to day. Look, I think the governor has been appropriately deliberate in looking at this. I don't think there are many people that already have been calling on him to step down or for her to remove him. But I think when someone's democratically elected, whether they are good or bad, I think it's very tough to say you're going to have, in this case, the governor remove somebody who was elected. Now, if he's not capable of running the city, and if there's no one there to work with him, that changes the question, and I think that's what's being looked at now. And I actually read in one of the articles something I really wasn't aware of. There's something called an inability review committee, I guess under the city charter, where certain designated elected officials can take an action if a mayor is not able to function in their job. So that it may not just be the governor's call on this. It may also be some of the city leadership under the city charter that may be able to take over the running of the city. So I don't know, but by the time our conversation is aired,
right,
it may be a very different picture. But it would be fair to say that Mayor Adams began with great promise, and the end of his term is anything but. And when you look at all the challenges facing New York City, they certainly need a functioning city government, and you're going to have a very interesting mayoral election this year, that's for sure.
What do you think about your predecessor, the former controller, Carl McCall, saying, hey, former Governor Andrew Cuomo, you should run for mayor? And, of course, the polls show he would win.
Yeah, well, probably given the history, many people were a bit surprised by that. On the other hand, I think, Carl McCall and Andrew Cuomo had buried the proverbial hatchet a long time ago, so I think they've probably been more on the same page in recent years than not. But, again, for someone of the prominence of Carl McCall this early, to not only weigh in and say there needs to be a different mayor, but, designate someone as his favorite, I think that probably surprised a lot of folks and certainly, I think, added to the possibility of Andrew Cuomo jumping into the race.
Well, we've only got about a minute left, and I wanted folks to know about this if they don't. You have something on your website called Open Book New York. I almost think about it like when you go and try to see, the restaurant reviews and to see if they're doing it right or doing it wrong. But tell folks about Open Book New York.
That's our transparency initiative that goes back from when I first started, and we keep enhancing it. It is a way for New Yorkers to see how their tax money is being spent. So we have information on there about state agency spending, contracts, also for public authorities, and local governments as well. It's interesting that you mentioned it, Dave, because the press, journalists like yourself, are often the most frequent users of the site.
That's why I know about it.
Yeah, but it's also there for everyday people. Also, folks who maybe wanting to do business with the state, they want to see what kind of contracts are out there. Maybe they lost out on the contract bid. They want to see who got it and what how they're spending the money. So there are many uses, and it's a very user friendly site. So whatever your listener's search engine is, just put in New York State Comptroller, click on the Open Book part of the website, and you can get lost in looking at state money being spent, contracts, how your school district is spending what money, and compare what your village is doing versus the village next door. So it's very interesting and very important information that is readily accessible, and that's why we call it Open Book. It's really opening up the checkbook of the state so that people can see how their money's being spent.
Always so much more I could talk to you about. The State Comptroller, Tom DiNapoli, has been our guest on the Capital Connection this week. I'm David Gustina. Tom, my goodness, legal cannabis say they crossed $1 billion threshold. We have audits upon audits we could talk about.
Well, you'll have to have me back again soon.
That's right.
When the thaw comes in, that's when we'll do it again. How does that sound?
All right. Well, you make a point. I can have you back. Tom DiNapoli, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks, David.
Support for the Capital Connection comes from New York State United Teachers, working to support students, educators, and public schools as the center of their communities through the Public Schools Unite Us initiative. The Capital Connection is a production of WAMC Northeast Public Radio. You can listen to The Capital Connection anytime at WAMCpodcast.org or anywhere you get your podcast. And join us again next week at this same time for another political conversation. For The Capital Connection, I'm David Gustina.